Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 14 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. Now, we are 1 week away from the fantasy football playoffs, weeks 15 through 17, where champions are crowned. And of course, in many of our situations, we are in a win-to-get-in scenario. And if that describes your current scenario going into Week 14, of course, the 6 teams that are to the right of me are obviously going to play a factor, as we are going into the second bye-apocalypse of the season, as we have the Atlanta Falcons, Chicago Bears, Green Bay Packers, Indianapolis Colts, New Orleans Saints, and Washington Commanders all on bye week. Now, there's a lot of players that we've relied upon over the course of this season, like a Justin Fields, Aaron Jones, Jonathan Taylor, that have gotten us to these positions. Now, unfortunately, we will not have the services of said players, but going into Week 14, and specifically going into today's episode, we're going to be naming some players that you could potentially go after via the waiver wire in order to bolster your roster and give yourselves the best chance to win to get in if, in fact, you don't have the services of these players. And not only are we going to have to deal with potential bye weeks going into Week 14 in order to make our fantasy playoffs, of course, we're going to have to deal with a lot of injuries. The injuries that were sustained in Week 13 were aplenty. Lamar Jackson, Jimmy Garoppolo out for the season, Tua Tagovailoa, Hayden Hurst, Treylon Burks, of course, with a concussion, Kenneth Walker, Aaron Jones, Jalen Waddle. Obviously, he still managed to come back in the game, but something was obviously bothering him. Cortland Sutton, Isaiah Likely, Quez Watkins, and the list continues to go on. There have been a lot of injuries that took place this last week that are obviously impacting our fantasy lineups. And of course, there's a lot of bye weeks that we're going to have to deal with. So over the course of today's episode, we're going to be talking about prospects at the running back, wide receiver, tight end, quarterback, kicker, and defensive positions going into this week that could give you an opportunity to not only win, but also give you fantasy depth for the remainder of the season as we push towards the playoffs, weeks 15 through 17, in order to capture a 2022 fantasy football championship, because that's the entire goal for this channel. So if you guys have not yet already, be sure to do yourself a favor, click that subscribe button down below. We're making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season. Later tonight, after the Monday Night Football game between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and New Orleans Saints, I will be live streaming here on the channel. If you guys have any questions regarding potential waiver wire prospects, be sure to swing on by and ask away. I'll be sure to help you guys out to the best of my abilities. Speaking of tonight's game, again, if you guys haven't checked out PrizePicks and want to continue to play daily fantasy, you can go ahead and check out the link down in the description. When you sign up today using promo code ANDREW, you get your first deposit doubled immediately up to $100. So if you deposit 20, you're given an additional 20. If you deposit 50, you're given an additional 50. Check that out today. The reason why I specifically wanted to mention is because, again, if you don't have anybody playing tonight, but you want to have some extra skin in the game in regards to playing daily fantasy via tonight's game, you can go ahead and do so via PrizePicks. Also, they currently have a special offer going into the week with Justin Herbert. If he goes ahead on Sunday against the Miami Dolphins and throws for more than 0.5 passing yards, which is an automatic, you go ahead and you have a free entry. You can go ahead, put together a potential entry going into this week that includes Justin Herbert today. Again, there's a link down in the description. Be sure to use promo code Andrew and take advantage of the free square going into this week. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into talking about our Week 14 waiver wire targets, beginning with our number 1 at the running back position is Zonovan Knight. Zonovan Knight continues to be in this conversation based on a lot of reasons. First and foremost, when we went into yesterday's game, I was under the assumption that this was going to be a running back by committee based on all the reports that we heard over the course of the week. Now, we knew that Zonovan Knight was going to be the first and foremost leading back, but I did not anticipate him to have 20 touches, 15 on the ground, and 5 through the air on 5 targets. Incredible numbers, while we still had James Robinson active in that game and, of course, Ty Johnson. Now, in comparison to those two other options, James Robinson only had 4 rushing attempts and Ty Johnson only had a singular attempt. Now, Ty Johnson certainly got himself a lot of utilization in the receiving game with his 6 receptions, but overall, the fact that we are continuing to see Zonovan Knight be the primary number 1, having played 55% of the snaps, and of course, like I mentioned, had himself 20 carries and totaled himself 118 all-purpose yards. An incredible week for Zonovan Knight, and going forward, could definitely cut into Michael Carter's work even if he returns. And we're not expecting him to return this week. So another one of these fantastic plays that we want to have on roster going forward in a pretty good matchup against Buffalo this week. Moving on to our number 2, we have Cam Akers. We mentioned Cam Akers a couple weeks ago as someone that we wanted to have on roster. But over the course of the last couple weeks since I mentioned that, Kieran Williams began to step up in this backfield, mainly because of the game scripts. The game scripts were not in favor of the Los Angeles Rams running the ball in the second half based on the teams that they were playing. But yesterday against the Seattle Seahawks, it was a completely different conversation. As we saw, Cam Akers play 72% of the offensive snaps as he had 17 carries for 69 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns for 18.5 half PPR fantasy points. An incredible week overall. Now, going forward, their upcoming schedule consists of the Las Vegas Raiders, Green Bay Packers, Denver Broncos, and Los Angeles Chargers. A couple good teams there, but what I see across the board is the fact that a lot of these teams struggle in terms of stopping the run. And if Cam Akers and this offense as a whole with John Wolford can be competitive, it absolutely gives him enough fantasy value to be a relevant top 36 option going forward. Moving on to our number 3, we have James Cook. Again, I wanted to mention James Cook, even though we did talk about him quite a bit actually after last Thursday night's game against the New England Patriots. I want to mention and give you guys another reminder. Again, he's only rostered in 23% of leagues. When I talk about players, I'm typically mentioning players that are rostered in less than 50% of Yahoo formats, but in this current circumstance, James Cook should be available in your league, hopefully. If he's not, of course, you play in a deeper league and you got a lot of sharps ready to go in there. But in terms of what he is potentially going to provide for our team, again, James Cook's coming off a week in which he had 14 carries for 64 yards and 6 targets that led to 6 receptions and 41 receiving yards. Overall, 105 all-purpose yards as an offensive player and had himself 20 touches. Similar numbers to what Zonovan Knight was presented within that New York Jets backfield, but the difference is James Cook had to share with Devin Singletary. Yes, the game script for that game obviously lent more opportunity to James Cook getting himself rushing attempts in that first and second half. But ultimately, when we're talking about these guys splitting snaps, quite literally 33 snaps to 32 within the given game, and on top of that, Devin Singletary was absent on a couple drives. They were pretty much going every other drive. One drive would be Devin Singletary, the other James Cook. And if they're going to continue to present more and more opportunities to their second string running back, their rookie back going forward, obviously the sky's the limit for this incredible back. Moving on, let's talk about DeeJay Dallas. Now, as you can see his picture right next to me, he's definitely a character. But the reason we want to mention DeeJay Dallas is because, of course, Kenneth Walker left that game yesterday and did not participate in the second half. DeeJay Dallas is expected to be the primary back if, in fact, we do see Kenneth Walker miss time. But the reason why I have DeeJay Dallas all the way down here in comparison to these other running backs is because the Seahawks organization has already come out and said that Kenneth Walker's injury is not considered serious. So if, in fact, he's only going to miss a singular week, sure, for those of you who have the services of Kenneth Walker or are in need of a running back, of course, DeeJay Dallas can fill in that stead. Now, there are other running backs that could participate in this backfield. Tony Jones Jr., we saw a little bit of a glimpse from yesterday. Obviously, Travis Homer, he's still dealing with a little bit of a knee sprain, but going forward, we could see a three-headed monster in this backfield. But for as of right now, if in fact we're under the assumption that we're trying to protect the investment of a Kenneth Walker with a backup running back, the next play in mind would be to pick up DeeJay Dallas going forward. Moving on, let's talk about Chuba Hubbard. Coming off of the bye week, we want to mention Chuba Hubbard because the last time we saw him, he played against the Denver Broncos defense. Besides the fact that we saw Deontay Foreman accumulate 24 rushing attempts and over 100 rushing yards, we still saw Chuba Hubbard with 17 rushing attempts and 65 rushing yards in that singular game. Now they play up against the Seattle Seahawks, who quite literally could not stop the run against the Los Angeles Rams. So if you can't stop the Rams, there's a pretty good potential that they won't be able to stop the Carolina Panthers either. And if that's going to lead to a run-heavy attack from the Carolina Panthers, then by all means, we may see a two-headed monster out of this backfield. I'm expecting Chuba Hubbard to potentially have value in this given week, and based on the matchups going ahead, could be of value as a handcuff with more upside. Moving on to the final option, we have Jordan Mason. Again, he has established himself as the number 2 of this backfield. No Tyrion Davis-Price, no Tevin Coleman. Tevin Coleman wasn't even elevated from the practice squad, but Jordan Mason is pretty much here just to serve as a reminder to pick up handcuffs. Now, other handcuffs that you might want to, pick up. Obviously, we've besides seen, guys like Samaje Perine go off in the absence of Joe Mixon as of late. We're talking about guys like Jerick McKinnon for Isaiah Pacheco, guys like Ty Johnson for a Zonovan Knight. Players that are going to have value in their own right, but also have handcuff potential for the future, especially when we're talking about the fantasy playoffs. You never want to be in a situation where you win a week, but you lose a running back, and because of the fact that you don't have their handcuff on roster, and you don't have waiver priority or enough fab to establish yourself that pickup in the given week, you end up losing. So you want to go ahead, make sure your investments are there, specifically getting insurance policies on your primary blue chip running backs going forward. Okay, let's move on to the wide receiver conversation for today's video. Beginning with Jameson Williams, the rookie wide receiver for the Detroit Lions. Now, Jameson Williams was active, but basically what we heard from the Fox Studios prior to the game, specifically from Jay Glazer, was that he was going to play special teams as a gunner. I don't know why they would activate him to do that. I know he got a singular target in that game. All in all, it is what it is. We're going to look at Jameson Williams as someone who potentially will have value going forward within this offense, considering the Detroit Lions are in a conversation where if they continue to win games and continue to beat up teams like the way that they have over the course of the last month here, they could very easily be in playoff contention. So, Jameson Williams joining this team this week has himself an opportunity of taking on the Minnesota Vikings. It is quite literally the best matchup at the wide receiver position going into the week. I honestly believe that Jameson Williams will be heavily utilized going forward, and that is why we want to have him on roster. I know he's already rostered in 47% of leagues, but we still have to mention him. Moving on to Corey Davis. Corey Davis, again, the fact that now he is associated with a pass-heavy offense completely elevates all receiving threats within this backfield. Tight ends, running backs, and especially wide receivers. The fact that Corey Davis is coming off a week in which he had 5 receptions on 10 targets, 85 receiving yards, and 11 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format is fantastic. He currently only rostered in 13% of leagues, and like we did last week, during the Week 13 waiver wire video, I mentioned Elijah Moore. Then on Wednesday, for the wide receiver rankings video, I mentioned Corey Davis because, quite frankly, Corey Davis played more snaps. He will continue to play more snaps than Elijah Moore and will continue to be on the field and be a primary option. And that was a given. And it was pretty much presented to us as such based on his performance on Sunday. The fact that the Jets threw the ball 57 times was quite, surprising to me. But going forward in their upcoming schedule of Buffalo, Detroit, Jacksonville, and Seattle, I expect them to continue to throw the ball a boatload of times, and Corey Davis will certainly be benefiting from that going forward as a fantastic wide receiver 3 option. Moving on to Nico Collins, their number 3. Now, Brandon Cooks was not active in this game, yet we still saw Nico Collins get himself double-digit targets, 10 total, which quite frankly isn't that uncommon for Nico Collins. He's continued to see a high volume of targets as of late. Unfortunately, only caught 3 of his 10 total targets for 35 yards, but scored a touchdown. As long as we continue to see Nico Collins be a primary receiving threat out of this offense, whether it is with, Davis Mills, Kyle Allen, it doesn't matter whether Brandon Cooks is active or not. If Brandon Cooks comes back this week against Dallas, he's going to pull primary coverage from Trayvon Diggs, which will help Nico Collins because the number 2 cornerback for the Dallas Cowboys, Anthony Brown, season-ending Achilles injury, could end up helping Nico Collins and his potential value in this given week, only, potentially rostered in 29% of Yahoo formats right now. Moving on to Isaiah McKenzie. In the last 2 consecutive games, he's been a pretty active part of this offense, getting himself 15 total targets, which in my mind continues to build upon his potential for the future. Now, with Gabriel Davis being a quiet threat in this offense as of late, and Stephon Diggs being the primary number 1, and even seeing Jamison Crowder return to this roster last week on Thursday night, I'm continuing to expect Isaiah McKenzie to be more and more of an option for Josh Allen going forward. He continues to dump the ball off to running backs, which will certainly cut into the overall workload of Isaiah McKenzie. But what we have noticed over the course of the last 2 weeks, while Isaiah McKenzie has been more and more of an option within this offense, is the complete removal of Dawson Knox as a receiving threat. If I'm not mistaken, Dawson Knox quite literally has gone for 0 fantasy points in 2 consecutive weeks, or at least has had low numbers. I know this last week had a goose egg on Thursday against Bill Belichick. Either way, Isaiah McKenzie has value going forward for sure, considering the offense he's associated with. Moving on to Terrace Marshall Jr. Coming off of the bye week, we wanted to mention a couple players. Now, when we looked at the Arizona Cardinals coming off bye, we all know that guys like DeAndre Hopkins, Marquise Hollywood Brown, and of course Rondale Moore are going to be rostered. But on the other end of the spectrum, the Carolina Panthers offense, DJ Moore is the only guy that you kept through the Week 13 bye in terms of the wide receiver position for this team. So if Terrace Marshall is available, he absolutely could have value going up against the Seattle Seahawks this week. Again, Sam Darnold is going to be the starting quarterback for this team. Henceforth, we know that they cut Baker Mayfield earlier today. Baker Mayfield may be a surprise signing for the San Francisco 49ers if they're trying to make a playoff push. Not saying that they're going to play him, but as a backup option going forward. But that is, remaining to be seen. We'll see how that kind of, transpires over the course of the next couple weeks. But as of right now, Terrace Marshall, currently only rostered in 6% of leagues, is going to continue to see a lot of, potential targets in the upcoming weeks, especially considering the matchups that they have on hand and the fact that Sam Darnold is continuing to, on a weekly basis, want to win this job and maintain the starter going into 2023, which of course his performances with Terrace Marshall are going to matter. Moving on to the final option, I wanted to mention DJ Chark, mainly because I have a little bit of a suspicion that this offense, this team as a whole for the Detroit Lions, they're going to make some stupid mistakes here and there. And the fact that they play Jameson Williams only to play him on special teams and get him a couple reps here and there is fine. But quite frankly, if they end up doing what they did to DeAndre Swift to Jameson Williams and have him slow to return and don't give him a huge workload, that's going to be unfortunate, but then DeeJay Chark would be the benefactor of that primarily, because DeeJay Chark, coming off of a week in which he had 5 catches for 98 yards against the Jacksonville Jaguars, a revenge game against his former team. Obviously a big performance, but going forward could continue to be of value. I mean, just a couple weeks back against the Buffalo Bills, 3rd down, instead of lining up for a field goal and having like a quick slant or, a rushing attempt to pretty much, kick the ball in, they threw the ball 30 yards downfield. If Jared Goff was on the same page as DeeJay Chark, they score a touchdown there because he was wide open. Unfortunately, was not able to bring it down because of Jared Goff's inaccuracy within that given pass. For those of you who know what I'm referencing to, again, there was a lot of potential over the course of the last couple weeks for DeeJay Chark to be a relevant fantasy option. But going forward, if Jameson Williams is messed around with this coaching staff, the same in which they've done to DeAndre Swift over the course of the last 2 months here, then DeeJay Chark could be of value. Outside of these potential 6 players, we have a couple honorable mentions that I won't throw up on screen, but I want to mention Jahan Dotson for the Washington Commanders and Alec Pierce for the Indianapolis Colts. Both them scored a touchdown. Both them produced over 13.9 half PPR fantasy points. Incredible numbers, and both of them are only rostered in 15% of Yahoo leagues. Unfortunately, both go on by, but if in fact you are in a situation where you're just trying to bolster the best remaining players to build for the fantasy playoffs because you've already clinched the spot, Alec Pierce and Jahan Dotson could be a value going forward. Let's talk about tight ends and quarterbacks. Speaking of going forward, let's begin with Greg Dulcich. Now, I want to start with Greg Dulcich under the preface that Evan Ingram should already be rostered in your league. I know he's only rostered in 43% of leagues, but in terms of the depth at tight end, Evan Ingram should be rostered in majority of leagues. So we're going to go ahead and assume that he already is. So let's begin with Greg Dulcich, only rostered in 37% of leagues, coming off of a week in which he had 6 catches on 8 targets for 85 yards. Finally, a resurgence from him. Now, if you guys remember me talking about this, in week 12, he had a touchdown reception called back due to a holding penalty. There are many scenarios here, and quite frankly, that holding penalty wasn't really, important on the play. It wasn't going to make the biggest difference as to whether or not Russell Wilson was able to complete that pass. But either way, going into this given week and going forward, Greg Dulcich should be an option considering Courtland Sutton went down with a hamstring injury, and he could continue to be a primary receiving option for this offense, who is in desperate need of primary receivers. Moving on to Noah Fant. Now, speaking of another tight end that, as of late, hasn't been much, but every now and then will put together a good performance. Now, going into week 14 against the Carolina Panthers, it is quite honestly an advantageous matchup. But typically we see either a 4.5-point performance from Noah Fant or a 10-point performance. And typically the difference between the two is either a high capacity of targets or a touchdown opportunity that leads to a touchdown reception. Now, obviously, those are really difficult things to predict, especially with the infrequency of touchdowns from his specific, opportunity standpoint. But at this current moment in time, I still believe that Noah Fant could be a value going forward, specifically because of the Carolina Panthers matchup and how many fantasy points they've allowed to opposing tight ends as of late. Moving on to our final option, Chigoziem Okonkwo. Very difficult name to pronounce, but hey, I've figured it out. So here's the thing about this tight end. He's still technically splitting snaps with Austin Hooper, but over the course of the last couple weeks here, he's beginning to build more and more momentum within this offense. He's quite literally rostered in 0% of leagues, which makes sense considering he's kind of seen as a backup tight end. But going forward in terms of the amount of targets he's getting and his ability to make plays after the catch, and the lack of receiving threats within this Tennessee Titans offense leads me to believe that we're going to continue to see Ryan Tannehill continue to go back to Okonkwo on a weekly basis. Now, with Treylon Burks going down with that concussion, probably will miss this upcoming week. They take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think this is an advantageous matchup enough to where Okonkwo could be of value to you for those of you who are in desperate need of tight end depth. Let's move on to the quarterback conversation, beginning with our number one, Mike White. Mike effing White absolutely balled out. Now, even though he only had a 54.4% passing completion percentage, he was still 31 of 57, had 369 passing yards, and quite literally should have had 3 touchdowns in that game. On an earlier drive, had a quarterback sneak that unfortunately did not lead to a touchdown. He should have had one, though. So that would have been his second rushing touchdown of the day. But not only that, that pass to Braxton Berrios on the second to last drive should have been a touchdown. Unfortunately, Braxton Berrios wasn't able to haul that in. He could have had himself 3 touchdowns in the game, and quite frankly, could have had himself a boatload of fantasy points, which would have us all over him. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and think about his upcoming schedule against some secondaries that quite frankly aren't great. and expect a lot more upside and a lot more of a learning process from Mike White in the upcoming weeks. I'm not afraid of him turning over the ball, especially when you play in a league where you only get -1 per interception and only +4 per overall passing touchdown. If you're in a more hardcore league where it's 6 points per passing touchdown and -4 for interception, then we're in a pretty tricky situation there, but not many of you play in those hardcore leagues. All right, moving on to our number 2, we have Tyler Huntley. We have already been given an indication that Lamar Jackson is most likely going to miss this week. Tyler Huntley, for those of you who remember him last year, was quite frankly a good fantasy option. In the 5 starts that he had in 2021, he was averaging 16.02 fantasy points per game in a 4 point per passing touchdown format. He came into yesterday's game and was 27 for 32 passing. 27 for 32. This is no joke. An 84.4% passing completion percentage. Yes, was able to get himself a lot of utilization on the ground. 10 rushing attempts for 41 yards and a rushing touchdown. 15.58 fantasy points in a pretty good, contest against a pretty good defense in the Denver Broncos secondary. Now they go up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. In my opinion, it's an easier secondary to produce against. Tyler Huntley, honestly, is a fantastic fantasy option for those of you who are going to be missing Lamar Jackson and have no other options, or perhaps are going to be missing the services of a Justin Fields in this given week, or someone that is in that, bye-week apocalypse, Marcus Mariota, Taylor Heineke, who have played well over the course of the last month here. Tyler, Huntley should be a pretty good option. Also, I don't want to forget to mention the main reason why Mark Andrews was able to dethrone Travis Kelce last year, like I've mentioned to you guys all offseason, was because of the help from Tyler Huntley. Tyler Huntley funnel targeted him all last season. I'm expecting that to be the case going into the remainder of this season, if in fact Tyler Huntley is going to play for an extended amount of time. Hopefully it'll only be a 1 week kind of pivot here, considering Lamar Jackson's knee injury, but we're going to have to wait and see either way. All right, the final option I wanted to mention at quarterback is Ryan Tannehill. They take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. We just saw the Detroit Lions absolutely slaughter this team on both sides of the ball. And quite frankly, the Tennessee Titans are in a 2-game skid against the Cincinnati Bengals and against the Philadelphia Eagles. 2 top-tier teams that, in my opinion, are probably going to be, a couple of those teams in the AFC and NFC championship games going into this year. So in order to get back on track, you take on the Jaguars. You're going to run all over them. You're going to be able to distribute the ball through the passing game. And hopefully Ryan Tannehill, currently only rostered in 17% of leagues, could have himself a great performance. Let's move on to kickers, defenses, special teams, all of that encompassed within the next panel. Beginning with our first kicker that we want to pick up, it is Matthew Wright. Matthew Wright has been fantastic in terms of fantasy points over the course of the last month here as the starting kicker of this team. Of course, with Chris Boswell on the injured reserve, we mentioned Matthew Wright last week, and he continues to deliver. Actually, maybe it was a couple weeks ago, and he continues to deliver. Only rostered in 7% of leagues, takes on the Baltimore Ravens defense, could end up leading to a lot of field goals in the given matchup. Moving on to Michael Badgley. Michael Badgley, again, had himself a massive game yesterday against the Jacksonville Jaguars defense. And prior to that, the 3 prior weeks put up 7, 7, and 7. Okay, decent weeks, but I think going forward, specifically against the Minnesota Vikings at home in a must-win game for the Detroit Lions, we're going to continue to see him get his leg definitely involved in the contest. The final player I wanted to mention is Cameron Dicker, currently rostered the most out of these 3, 37% of leagues. Again, he continues to be a valuable option for this offense as they continue to lean upon him and his leg to continue to make plays. I think Cameron Dicker, in terms of fantasy purposes, scoring about 8 to 10 fantasy points per game over the course of the last month here with this team is in a pretty good option. Moving on, let's talk about defenses and special teams, beginning with the Kansas City Chiefs. I love the Kansas City Chiefs not only because they play against the Denver Broncos this week, but the following week to begin the fantasy playoffs, they take on the Houston Texans. Then again, they will take on the Denver Broncos in week 17. You want to play the Kansas City Chiefs for the remainder of the season. I know their defense has not been great over the course of the year, but I think this is an advantageous matchup for not only this week, but 3 out of the next 4. Moving on to the Tennessee Titans. We want to mention that because they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars this week, and they take on the Houston Texans in week 16. If in fact you already have a stud defense like the Dallas Cowboys, Philadelphia Eagles, San Francisco 49ers, that you're going to be primarily starting in week 15, you can lead upon the Tennessee Titans in week 16 when they take on the Houston Texans and, of course, run all over them and dominate across the board. Now, the final defense I wanted to mention are the Las Vegas Raiders. They will be taking on the LA Rams this week. I am of the opinion that the Las Vegas Raiders will still be able to be efficient enough to stop this offense at times and at least score enough fantasy points to be a relevant top 12 capacity within the given week. That's even without a potential touchdown or anything of that extent. We're just talking about points allowed, sacks, interceptions, fumbles recovered, all of that kind of jazz across the board. That's going to cover it for me today. Again, thank you everybody for watching. Those are our Week 14 waiver wire targets for the 2022 fantasy football season. Again, there are a lot of bye weeks. There are a lot of injuries. And for those of us who are in a win-to-get-in scenario going into Week 15, again, you got to make sure that your roster is ready to go at the highest capacity in order to win your matchups this week. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Don't forget to be sure to check out PrizePicks. Again, they have a current offer for this week in regards to Justin Herbert going more than 0.5 passing yards. Be sure to check that out today. Use promo code Andrew, and when you do so, your first-time deposit is immediately doubled up to $100. So again, if you deposit $50, you're going to be given $50 bonus within the app. If you deposit $10, the minimum, you'll be given $10. You can go ahead, put together some entries, including Justin Herbert going into this upcoming weekend's matchup, or go ahead and include some entries for tonight's game between the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and, of course, New Orleans Saints. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Be sure to click the like button, subscribe if you have not yet already. And until tomorrow, we'll be talking about some running back rankings. And, of course, later tonight after the Monday Night Football game, as I'll be live streaming on the channel, be sure to check that out. Subscribe, and I'll see you guys. Peace.